Oliver Twist 4.
One day, Oliver noticed that two strange men were spying on him through a window. He became scared when he realized one of the men was Fagin. Oliver screamed for help, but they had already disappeared. The other man was in fact Monks, and he arranged a meeting with Mr. and Mrs. Bumble. Since marrying the matron of the poorhouse where Oliver had been born, Mr. Bumble had been running the poorhouse with his wife. Monks bought the locket from Mr. and Mrs. Bumble. It was the locket that had once belonged to Oliver's mother. It contained a ring with the name Agnes on it. Monks decided to destroy any evidence that could show who Oliver truly was. He threw the jewelry into the river. During all this time, Bill Sikes, who had broken into Mrs. Maylie's house with Oliver, had been sick in bed. He had been nursed by Nancy, and so had made a very good recovery. Nancy happened to know that Monks and Fagin planned to destroy Oliver. She secretly met with Rose Maylie and told her what she had heard Fagin and Monks talking about. Nancy told her that Monks, a greedy and evil man, was Oliver's half-brother. Rose decided to visit Mr. Brownlow to ask him to help Oliver. Rose told Mr. Brownlow about Monks and the plan to hurt Oliver. Mr. Grimwig was also told what had happened. They all decided to help Oliver avoid falling into the evil trap that was being set for him. Meanwhile, Fagin had become suspicious of Nancy. He sent someone to spy on her. The spy later told Fagin that Nancy had told Mr. Brownlow how he could trap Monks. Fagin then told Bill Sikes that Nancy was a traitor. Sikes became very angry. After he got home, he attacked Nancy. He beat poor Nancy to death. Mr. Brownlow had managed to track down Monks and taken him to his home. Gradually, many mysteries unfolded. It turned out that Mr. Brownlow's best friend, Edwin Leaford, was actually the father of Monks. It also came to light that Edwin Leaford had been forced into a marriage which had turned out to be a very unhappy one. Monks was the only child that Edwin Leaford had with his wife. After separating from his wife, Leaford had fallen in love with another woman. Her name was Agnes Fleming. Edwin Leaford, however, had had to leave for Italy to sort out the property that had been left to him by a relative. Tragically for Agnes, Edwin died in Italy. At the time of Edwin's death, Agnes was pregnant. She was pregnant with Oliver. Edwin Leaford had left a painting of Agnes with his friend Mr. Brownlow. This was the painting that Oliver had seen in Mr. Brownlow's home. It was the painting of a woman who looked like Oliver. Mr. Brownlow learned that the locket that had belonged to Oliver's mother had been in Mr. and Mrs. Bumble's hands, and that it had then been sold to Monks. Monks had thrown it away as part of his plan to destroy Oliver. It was discovered that Edwin Leaford had left most of the family fortune to Agnes Fleming and her expected child. Monks had paid Fagin to trap Oliver and force him into a life of crime, so that he would be able to keep all of the fortune. In the end, Fagin and some of his criminal friends were arrested by the police. Fagin was found guilty and sentenced to death. Mr. and Mrs. Bumble admitted their part in trying to cover up Oliver's background, and Bill Sikes, who was chased by the police for the murder of Nancy, ended up accidentally killing himself. And there were even more surprises. It turned out that Rose was not Mrs. Maylie's niece after all. Rose was, in fact, the younger sister of Agnes Fleming. It therefore meant that she was actually Oliver's aunt. Oliver shared his fortune with his half-brother. However, Monks later died in prison a penniless man. Mr. Brownlow adopted Oliver and raised him as if he were his own son. They lived near Rose. However, while the ending of the story was happy for Oliver, it was not so happy for Mr. and Mrs. Bumble. They ended up in the same poorhouse where Agnes Fleming had died after giving birth to Oliver.